Chancellor.
It's a real pleasure, Mr. Chancellor, to be able to welcome you here this afternoon. A real pleasure as well because it's not the first time, and you are a partner for discussion here who is much in demand. It's also a pleasure that despite the fact that you have a packed program, you've managed to find the path back to Davos, especially now that I believe you have successfully managed to get your stability program in movement, which is something which is not always easy in a coalition. And I'm sure that you have earned the admiration of many people in the hall here, not only in the way that you have managed to steer your way through this crisis, but also in the way that you have used your own courage and your own approach. And we all look very much to hearing your speech.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Schwab,
Professor Schwab,
ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and privilege to be able to be here today in Davos.
This obviously comes at a point in time which is a very interesting one indeed, and I'm more than pleased to be able to give my contribution to this very ambitious title, Shaping the Post-Crisis World. How do we wish to shape this world? We all know that this World Economic Forum takes place in very difficult times that don't exactly bode well for the future. We, I think, are all aware that this global crisis can only be mastered, that we can only cope with it if we do it together. And what I have heard as message coming from Davos over these past recent days is that we need to go into coping with this crisis also with a certain measure of confidence. Almost all countries are currently seeing sharp downturns in economic growth. One characteristic of that is that it is a global phenomenon. The European Commission, for example, is expecting an overall contraction of the economy for the European Union by 1.8% for this year. In many areas in the world, whether it be Asia, the United States of America, we have seen very dramatic contractions and downturns of the economy. So each and every one is in on this. No one is spared, and that was one characteristic of this crisis. This crisis, I think we're all in agreement on this, was triggered off by irresponsible speculation, in particular on the American real estate market. What we've seen here is our excesses of the market, injecting huge amounts of money that in the form of derivatives were spread around the world, were rendered anonymous. There was no transparency really to speak of. After world economic growth significantly slowed down, and combined with this international financial crisis, what we now see is indeed an economic crisis of global scope. And what is essential now is to restore confidence, because one of the most important points that we have seen here is massive loss of confidence because of this failure of the markets to address this issue. But confidence is one of the basic pillars of a functioning economy. Without this basic confidence, companies will not invest. Without confidence, banks will not grant loans. And without confidence, consumers will certainly not spend any money in consumption. So without a restoration of this confidence, we will not be able to get back to the path to economic growth. And this is why, to put it very succinctly, the central task of politicians, as I see it now, is to restore the ability of markets to function, thereby creating new trust, new confidence that is placed on a sounder footing. In Germany, we are actually pursuing a twofold approach. Since we're champions and experts, we know that we also need to give our national contribution to help the German economy get back on its feet again, but also to add one little piece of the international mosaic in trying to promote economic growth globally. In this way, help build bridges for our economy and for our citizens that leads us to the next economic upswing, again restoring confidence. What is also important is to see to it that necessary reforms of rules, regulations and international institutions needs to be promoted at an international level, because an international crisis can, after all, only be solved at the international level. And the lessons learned can also only be learned and addressed at the international level. On that first point, as a response to the crisis, the federal government has launched a comprehensive package of measures, as Professor Schwab just said. It is indeed unparalleled in its dimension in the history of our country. But let me also say this. I am firmly convinced, as I trust most of you are, this certainly is an exceptional situation, an exceptional challenge, and exceptional situations call for exceptional measures. Taken together with what we've already done in last autumn, we actually launched a package for 2009 and 2010 as a fiscal stimulus package of an overall volume of 80 billion euros. We need to remember here that the Federal Republic of Germany, the federal government, actually pursues a policy where the automatic stabilizers are allowed to actually work and do their bit, which means that looking at our social security systems, this year we will have rising pensions, we will actually have much more money in our health system, and this again gives a boost to the economy, which means that the programs, for example, that the United States have launched and the European Union member countries have launched cannot be compared completely to what we are doing. We're not only pursuing short-term programs. What we want to do, rather, is to combine the necessary fiscal stimulus with measures to secure jobs and with long-term structural reforms. So what we're trying to do is not just simply weather this storm, not just simply surviving this crisis, but we want to have our eye firmly on the future and on how we get out of this crisis stronger than we went in. So on the one hand, we give guarantees, we offer guarantees to our businesses, and as has been done in many other countries as well, we also pursue a policy of cutting rates and taxes. The banking package needs to be further developed, but we also say we very much concentrate in Germany on looking ahead at the next decade, 5-6 years hence. We will have a very severe demographic change. What we have as a bonus, as a sort of 40, is the skilled labor that we have. And this is why we need to try and weather the storm by combining, for example, short-time work and qualification, further qualification of our skilled workers. The measures that we adopted mean for a very strong economy, such as Germany, quite a big burden. And I think it's also important that for a country such as the Federal Republic of Germany, public debt, public borrowing, a burden that constitutes on the nation is quite discussed in quite a lively way. Over the past few years, we've been pursuing a course also through raising taxes, consolidating the national budgets, where we had almost a balanced budget. And this is obviously why now we say we have won ourselves a little bit of freedom of maneuver, but we're also saying at the same time we need a limitation on new public borrowing. We also then need a plan of how to reduce the debts that we incur now. So over and above these additional measures, we need to combine this with a clear repayment schedule, a clear repayment scheme, and that we also need to install an automatic brake that, in our basic law, that limits further excessive public borrowing, simply because we're firmly convinced that we must not live above our means for any longer period of time. I know that this is not a debate maybe that is waged in quite that intensity in other countries. or is in the foreground. But it's something I think you ought to know, that we are not simply shirking that particular debate. We're not ignoring it. We're trying to work on this, and we must avoid, I think, all of us in the Western economies to perpetuate this kind of policy. And this is why we very clearly also have said we remain committed to the European Stability and Growth Pact. Let me also remind all of us that the euro is a system of currency within an internal market of 16 member states. Such a monetary system needs very clear rules and regulations. If this Stability and Growth Pact did not exist, this euro area and this acceptance of the euro would not be possible. And this is why we have always come strongly in favor of this Stability and Growth Pact. This brings me to my next issue, to the international dimension, and also to the conclusion that we need to draw at this level. This is precisely the issue. How do we address these global imbalances that have come into existence? To what extent do we say we feel committed not to continue living above our means? I think that this is one of the central tasks ahead. It is also, incidentally, one of the central causes that have brought about these imbalances at an international level in the first place. And since I'm somebody who firmly believes in democratic principles, it is very, very important to me that there needs to be a reconciliation between these objectives of whether we actually want to always live better or whether we actually want to be fair in our dealings with others. Now, what we need to do is to agree on a number of international guidelines, international rules and regulations. That is to say, crisis management as such is not sufficient. It was the right thing to do to have an international coordination also of the bank's rescue package. We need to continue that international debate. But at the beginning of April, as you know, during the G20 summit meeting in London, on the top of the agenda will be learning lessons from what has happened. We agreed on an action plan last year where we primarily wish to restore the function that financial markets originally ought to have, namely to serve, and I underline the word serve, the real economy. They forgot that at some point in time, and I think we need to remind them of that particular task. The action plan that we agreed on in Washington last November is something that we need to fill with life. The ministers of finance are working on this, and I think that this new U.S. administration has so far indicated to us that they wish to work for more transparency, for more containment of risks, and I'm confident that this will bring us to further good rules and regulations. I don't want to sort of cast my look back, but I would like to remind all of you that during the G8 presidency, in vain did Germany try to inject a little bit more transparency in the financial markets and in those products. At the time, it was very difficult, very much an uphill battle, and this is why I'm so pleased to see that we have indeed made progress on this, that there is increased awareness at the international level that this is necessary, and we as European member states shall be preparing very carefully, very comprehensively for this G20 meeting. In February, I will invite the European members of this G20 in order to do just that, and we will then approach the other partners and show them what we feel ought to be done so that we may more easily come to concrete results. Now, obviously, there is a question on the agenda. How does this future cooperation ought to be shaped? The G8 alone will not suffice. G20, I think, which so far only existed at the level of finance ministers, is a very good format to be followed also at the level of heads of state and government. And through international cooperation at this level, I am confident that new trust can be built international, and that it is also shown that we are ready to assume our responsibility. Now, what do we need to do? What sort of new principles do we need to define for our ourselves so that we may pursue this as a long-term goal. I think 5 elements need to be particularly addressed in this context. First, we need to say that we are firmly committed to the forces of free market economy that needs to allow market forces to play out freely, to flourish, because that is the driving force behind economic growth, as used to be the case before the crisis and is going to be the case after the crisis. Secondly, excesses of the market, irresponsible deeds that have occurred need to be prevented. I believe that in Germany, the social market economy has stood us in good stead. It has indeed served us as a good guideline how we can reconcile both. The principles of the social market economy are fairly simple ones, but they're also very clear-cut. The state is indeed the guardian of the economic and social order, so it is given a very clear-cut role. Competition is necessary, but it is something that also needs to be addressed with a certain measure of discipline, and these are, I think, principles on which we ought to agree. Freedom is the necessary preconditions for the forces of the market to play out freely, but the freedom of the individual needs to be limited if it takes sort of freedom away from others. And this function, this structuring function, if you like, is something that a market that is completely unfettered, I think, cannot take over. We need, therefore, clear-cut rules worldwide, quite in contrast to an unfettered capitalism that runs enormous financial risks and risks of another kind. But we also need to be very clear over not wishing to go again into experiments of social command economies. We also need an internationally integrated financial system that has the necessary institutions that shoulder international responsibility, because in the future too we will time and again come up against do we actually wish to hand over part of our responsibility to international organizations which will only render us able of acting internationally, because there is no functioning global international order of this kind at this point. We as member states of the European Union have, after all, learned our lesson from the past, because we have already transferred quite a lot of responsibility and powers to Brussels. It's not always easy when you're then being scolded by Brussels, when you're being sued at the European Court of Justice, but at the end of the day it has proved its worth for the member states of the European Union, and we do believe that this learning process, this learning curve, needs to be one that needs to be pursued by each and every one. We also, thirdly, need an open world economy. I think we have to be very vigilant at this point in time. This is why we need international coordination. We must not allow market forces to be completely distorted because each and every country fights for survival. Let me tell you very frankly, as a country that sees that the automotive industry is one of the very strong pillars of its economy, I'm very wary of seeing subsidies in the United States of America being injected right now into the automobile industry. Such periods must not be allowed to last for too long, because they inevitably, obviously, lead to a certain amount of distortion and also constitute protectionism, quite frankly. And there is no alternative to a free global market economy, and this is why we need to work for bringing the Doha round very quickly to a successful conclusion. Fourthly, sustainable use of our natural resources. Only in this way will we be able to preserve this creation also for future generations. There are two issues that will loom large on the agenda. First, climate protection. This year, this will have to stand the test of time. At the end of this year, in Denmark, the international agreement that constitutes the post-Kyoto agreement will have to be concluded. I'm very pleased to hear that the United States of America are much more open now than they used to be, entering the debate in a much more open mind. But we will only be able to agree on commitments if we, as industrialized countries, precede the developing countries. Otherwise, they will not follow us. This crisis actually is a further case in point that issues of this kind can only be addressed internationally, in this case through the Climate Convention at the United Nations level. As my fifth point, we mustn't lose sight of fighting poverty. We have increased in our budget to quite a considerable extent that part that is earmarked for development cooperation. Allowing these monies to slip now would not only mean that we are not really fulfilling our responsibilities, it would also mean that the gap, the chasm already opening up between us and the developing world would be even greater, and we would be betraying the promises that we have made with the Millennium Development Goals and others. All of these issues, where I can't go into the details today, need to be enshrined, laid down, for example, in the form of a charter for the global economic order. We might, for example, build on a charter that we could possibly agree on among the G20. This may perhaps at one point in time even lead to the establishment of a UN Economic Council, just as the Security Council was created after the Second World War. Just allow me to remind ourselves of the terrible times then, after the terrible crimes committed also through the National Socialists in my country. What we have been able to do, what kind of feat we were able to do with the creation of the Security Council and this international fora. We, I think, after this crisis, also need to draw the necessary institutional conclusion, work together, pull our forces together, and cooperate at the international level, if possible, because I don't know any other body that has this degree of international legitimacy. We all know it's a fairly slow, a fairly cumbersome body, but still it is the only one of this kind that we have. Next year, I will invite the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, ILO, the World Trade Organization, representatives of all of these international financial institutions, as I did during the G8 presidency, to talk with them about these principles, because I think this cooperation that has been in existence for very, very long among these international organizations is still not sufficient, and the standards that these individual organizations have already developed over time can then be brought together and forged into a common approach that will then be enshrined in a charter. So I think we are now at a point in time where, apart from these immediate measures to combat crisis, incredible opportunities are opening up. We are now seeing only the crisis, maybe. Over the past 20 years, actually, we have understood this also as engines to growth, after all. That was the flip side of this crisis. And now what we have to do is to shape out of this a situation, a global situation where our nations can live better together. After all, we have managed challenges of quite a different dimension. We have been able to overcome the two-block situation. We created peace and freedom for many countries. Apart from celebrating its 60th birthday this year, my country is also celebrating the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I grew up in what was then the German Democratic Republic. Today, I am Chancellor of the reunited Federal Republic of Germany. This shows to me nothing is impossible. And even this worldwide financial crisis can be mastered. We can master it in such a way that we may turn this into progress for a better living together on this planet. And this is the sort of opportunity that I see, the possibility I see for reconciling freedom with growth, with sustainable development, and looking at the difficulties that we have to master every day. Some of you will think that is far too visionary, but I think we have to have a clear-cut compass, a clear idea where we wish to go in this crisis, so that we do not resort to the old means that we used to use in the past, and so as to avoid the same sort of crisis happening again. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today.